beautiful and it's so elegant. And it's a little bit intimidating. But with a little bit of practice, you got this. Today we're gonna learn how to make this beauty, and we're gonna get to know Grandma a little bit as we dedicate this to her. Hi friends, my name is Sherry Ray, and this is Every Cake Tells a Story, where we get to learn how to decorate together and love others through cake art. Because as we go along, I'll share stories about the individual this cake is dedicated to. Today, it's Grandma. However, I think I am missing something. Because in most of my childhood memories of Grandma, she's got an apron on. I better put one on in honor of Grandma. 1 second. I think I'm all ready now, so let's get going and spread some love like icing.
First step, we gotta make a parchment paper template. So I'm gonna wrap my paper around my cake, mark it off, and cut it so it's the exact size of my cake. Take that parchment paper, fold it in half, then fold it in half again, and fold it in half once again, until you get a small little rectangle. I'm going to use a ruler to help make sure I have my lines evenly spaced horizontally and vertically. Then I'll use an edible marker to mark my paper. Cut on the lines, and we have instant template. It's time to transfer the template to the cake. I've pinned it in place in a couple spots. Now I will hold it down and lightly trace the top line as well as the bottom line. You can see I used this tool that looks like a tiny little pizza cutter. I thought this roller would just roll nice and lightly over my fondant. It went through my fondant a little bit. Not a big deal though. I'll cover it later. In hindsight, I should have used my Dresden tool. Once I pulled the template off, I decided those lines are way too far apart. I cut the template down, positioned it where I wanted it, and added a middle line. We've got all the foundation work done, and now the fun begins. We're ready to start decorating. I know Grandma's favorite color is blue, so I've prepared some royal icing, and we're gonna trace that bottom line on the cake. I'm going to use a round number 2 tip. To do this, I'll touch the tip lightly to my starting point. Then I pull away from the cake and let gravity pull the icing down. As I'm going, I'm always moving to the right to attach it to the next point. I'm applying even pressure and then lightening up on that pressure just a bit as I get towards the top. Tap it to the ending spot and you've got a drop line. After I've completed these drop lines all the way around the cake, I need to come back and go over them with another line. Actually, I'll do this 5 more times. This allows the royal icing to stand out and form a bridge. Later on, we'll pipe some gravity-defying strings to our bridge. Before we all fall asleep though, I'm gonna speed up this video. I did take all these lines really slow because, well, actually, it is still a bit more foundational, but the pretty is starting to come out. I also realized that my icing was not nearly as stiff as it should have been. It's been a while since I worked with royal icing. I should have been able to pull my tip further and let gravity do even more of the work, but it got the job done and I wanted it precisely on those lines, so I just took it slower and played with the consistency later. When I say with a little bit of practice, you've got this, I truly mean it. We've got our bridge done. We're gonna set the cake aside and make some roses, Grandma's favorite flower. To do this, I've got a Ziploc bag that I've cut 3 sides off of, and I've rolled out a red fondant log. I cut 4 slices off my log, roll out one of those slices into a smaller log, and then put them all in my zippy. Then I'm gonna slide my finger or my thumb over the top half of each of these to thin them out. I don't want the bottom part to be too thick, so I just tap that down a little bit. Starting with that smaller log, I will roll it up to make the center of our rosebud. The next step is adding those more circular petals. I'll take the first one, putting the left side down against the rosebud, but leaving the right side up. Then I can slide my second petal in between the first one and the rosebud. I can push the first petal completely down as well as the left side of the second petal. Do the same thing with the third petal, but this time placing the whole petal down to complete that row. Fan out the top of the petals a bit, and I've got my sweet little rosebud. It's quite tall, so I'll need to trim it down a bit. My roses will probably stay in place just fine, but I'm going to add a piece of spaghetti as extra security. I'm not taking any chances they might fall and break my strings. This is just one of the 8 roses I made. They're so pretty. I know Grandma's going to like them. Now it's time for those gravity-defying lines I keep talking about. We'll start at that middle horizontal line I added and lightly touch our number 1 tip to the cake. I'll squeeze my bag and pull away from the cake. Then, when my icing is long enough, I will end the line by touching the bridge we built. I'm constantly wiping away the tip before starting again, because it needs to be super clean for this technique. I've already played with the consistency, but you can see here, I still didn't have it right, because my string broke again. Let's talk about what I did when my strings broke though. You can see me carefully remove the broken string. Sometimes the icing will color the fondant with a slightly damp paintbrush. I can clean up that blue and you can't even tell it was there. It's all cleaned up and we're off again. I also use my paintbrush to clean up the bottom of my strings. Around this time, I realized I needed to stop and fix my icing, or this was gonna take a long time with a ton of frustration. That cake might end up out the window. I went back and added some more powdered sugar to firm it up a bit more. And then, before moving back to my cake, I tested it around the edge of my cake pan. It doesn't look pretty, but it sure helped figure it out. I've got the consistency, and now let's jump back in where our regular program is already in session. As I continue with the string work, I've found I like to kind of tuck the bottom of the string under the bridge, and that helps to straighten up the string if it's a bit droopy. Now let's add our rows. Start with a dab of royal icing to help glue it to the cake. And then I'll push the spaghetti stick into the cake as our extra security. And it's back to more strings. While I'm doing that, let's go meet Grandma.
I have known for months, since the idea of this channel first came to me, that my first cake would be dedicated to Grandma. You see, over the years, I have had so many different cake designs for her, but when I go home, I would much rather spend the time with the people I love instead of hours and hours in the kitchen. So all of those cake designs have been in Neverland until today. Let me introduce you to Grandma. Grandma is a sassy, spunky, fun-loving, dedicated woman. And she's the glue that holds our family together. Her door is always open and someone is always headed over to Grandma's house. If you're there on a Saturday or Sunday, she's always got a fresh pot of coffee and goodies for you. And you're liable to bump into somebody else because they just popped in for a visit too. Thankfully, Grandma's hospitality, it's not a recent thing. It goes all the way back to my childhood memories, and in fact, further back into her teen years.
When my grandparents first met, my grandma's hospitality was tested though. My grandpa had been hired to do some work outside Grandma's house.
He came in for a drink of water and an aspirin. Well, my grandma did not hear him correctly, and she whipped out that sassy side and she told him he could go sit on the stove if he wanted to burn his, behind. Thankfully, they figured that out.
Grandma got him a Tylenol, and they eventually celebrated over 60 years of marriage.
Grandma and Grandpa were always a solid unit, supporting each other in everything they did. They were farmers, and I remember as a kid going to the field with Grandma and running around like crazy in that dirt. But I was nowhere near as excited as Grandpa and the hired men were, because they knew that when that red van came pulling in, that Grandma was coming with a table and chairs for everyone to relax in during lunch. And even better, she came with a delicious homemade meal for everyone to enjoy. Grandpa developed Alzheimer's, and Grandma dutifully cared for him as his health continued to decline. When he moved into a nursing home, Grandma continued to care for him. She visited him almost every day. She continued to feed him and bringing his dirty laundry home, washing it at home, and bringing it back fresh and clean. My family is so fortunate to have this dedicated woman serving as the glue to this family. Now we better take a break from all these stories so we can really give this cake to Grandma.
One more section to go. So many strings. So many strings. My hand is so tired. But this cake was for Grandma. It's been in the works for years. It was a go big or go home kind of cake. I think we know what we're doing here, so let's move on to our next steps. They're much easier. I'm going to trace that middle horizontal line with my number 2 tip. I still want it to be rather thin, but I want to build it up just a little bit, so I'll go over it one more time. I think some white dots in between our roses would elevate this cake just a little bit more. I've got a number 3 tip here. I'll squeeze my piping bag and let the icing build up, release the pressure, and I've got a dot. I'll round it out with a dab from my paintbrush. I'll add 10 dots in between each rose. Fast forward to the top horizontal line, and I'll go over that just once with my number 2 tip as well. That's our last step. This cake is done.
Well, what do you think? Beautiful cake for a beautiful woman, Grandma. If this story rings true for you or someone you love, turn around and dedicate it to them, because we're all about loving others here. One thing I think when I look at this cake is, it's not quite done. It's beautiful. We've taken Grandma into account as we've decorated it, but it's missing something. Grandma loves birds. So we're gonna make some out of fondant next week and give the cake the appearance that they have done the decorating. Come back next week so we'll find out how to make the birds and we'll get to know Grandma a little bit better. Bye for now, friends.